This is more than just a history lesson about trees. It's really the story of a massive collision between two worlds, a fight over the very idea of what a forest is. For one world, a forest was everything, a home, a grocery store, a pharmacy, all rolled into one. But for the other, it was basically a factory for building a global empire. And that clash, well, it changed landscapes and lives forever. But before we dive deep into that, let me ask you a quick question. Just think about your day. What do the book you might be reading, maybe that piece of chocolate you're thinking about, and the desk or table you're near, what do they all have in common? The answer is probably a lot more fundamental than you'd expect. Yep, they all come from forests. The paper in your books, the oil from sal seeds that goes into some chocolates, dyes for your clothes, spices, wood, rubber, medicines. I mean, the list just goes on and on. It's kind of crazy when you realize how much forests are woven into the fabric of our daily lives. And that's exactly why they became so important and so fiercely fought over. And this gets us right to the heart of the problem, an empire that had an absolutely insatiable appetite. You see, we think of the Industrial Revolution as being all about coal and steel, right? But it was also built on a foundation of wood, a lot of wood. And Britain was running out. The first real push came from what was basically a national security crisis. By the early 1800s, England's famous oak forests were just vanishing, and that was a huge problem. Without strong oak trees, you can't build warships for the Royal Navy, and without the Royal Navy, the British Empire pretty much ceases to exist. So they sent out search parties to the colonies, especially India, desperate to find a new supply of timber. But if you think the Navy needed a lot of wood, oh boy, that was just the warm-up. The real game changer was the railway. Starting in the 1850s, railways became the literal arteries of the empire. You needed them to move troops around to control this huge territory, and you needed them to get raw materials out. And what's the one thing you need to build thousands upon thousands of miles of railway? An absolutely mind-boggling amount of wood. Just try to picture this. For every single mile of railway track, you needed between 1,760 and 2,000 wooden planks. They called them sleepers, and they were what held the rails in place. Now start multiplying that by thousands of miles, and the scale becomes just staggering. And the demand just exploded practically overnight. As early as the 1850s, in just one region, the Madras Presidency, they were cutting down 35,000 trees every single year just for these sleepers. Fast forward to 1890, and the railway network is 25,500 kilometers long. By 1946, it had ballooned to over 765,000 kilometers. The result was pretty simple. As the tracks spread, the forests all around them just vanished. So facing this crisis of disappearing forests, a crisis they pretty much created themselves, the colonial government needed a solution. They had to figure out a way to guarantee a permanent industrial-scale supply of timber. And their big idea? Something with a very official-sounding name: scientific forestry. Now, this is the most crucial part to understand. You have two completely opposite ways of seeing a forest. On one hand, you have the villagers' forest. To them, a good forest was this rich, diverse mix of all kinds of trees and plants. It provided everything: wood for fuel, leaves for animal fodder, fruits, roots, medicine. It was a living ecosystem that supported their entire community. On the other hand, you had the state's forest. To them, a good forest was a timber plantation. Just neat, straight rows of one valuable type of tree, like teak or sal. Everything else was just a weed getting in the way. And that, right there, is exactly what scientific forestry was all about. It was a system that looked at natural, complex forests and saw them as messy, chaotic, and unproductive. So the solution was simple: clear-cut them and replace them with these orderly, single-species plantations. It wasn't science for the sake of ecology. It was science for the sake of profit. So how do you put a plan like this into action? Well, the British brought in a German expert, a man named Dietrich Brandis. In 1864, he was made India's very first Inspector General of Forests. He got to work fast, setting up the Indian Forest Service and pushing through the Forest Act of 1865. This was the law that would give the state total control over the forests. And it's really important to remember that this wasn't just happening in British India. Over in Indonesia, the Dutch had the exact same problem. They needed wood for their ships and railways, and they came up with the exact same solution: their own set of forest laws in Java to take control. It was pretty much the standard colonial playbook. So we've talked about the trees and the timber, but what about the people? Well, this new system of management had an immediate and absolutely devastating human cost. For the communities who had lived in these forests for generations, their entire world was about to be flipped upside down. Just imagine this. Almost overnight, things that were just a normal part of survival suddenly became crimes. Cutting wood to build or fix your house? Illegal. Letting your cattle graze in the forest? Illegal. Collecting fruits, hunting for food, fishing? All of it was now against the law. People were basically forced to become criminals, to steal from the very forest that had always been their home. And there's this one petition from the Baiga community in 1892 that it hits you right in the gut. It says, "We daily starve. The only wealth we possess is our axe. We are now dying for want of food." I mean, that's the voice of people whose entire way of life was just erased by a government far away that only saw their home as a resource to be stripped. But these communities, they weren't just passive victims. They didn't just take this lying down. When you're faced with starvation and losing your home, you fight back. And that's exactly what they did, sparking rebellions all across the forest regions. One of the most famous of these uprisings happened in 1910 in a place called Bastar in central India. The government had just proposed reserving 2/3 of the forest, and that, on top of recent famines and high rents, was just the final straw. And don't picture this as some chaotic riot. No, this was organized. It all started with discussions in villages and at festivals. Then they started passing around these secret messages: a mango branch, a lump of dirt, a handful of chilies, which were signals to unite. They then went after the symbols of colonial rule, looting bazaars, attacking police stations, schools, and officials' homes. Of course, the British response was exactly what you'd expect: overwhelming force. Troops were sent in, the leaders were punished, and the rebellion was brutally crushed. But here's the amazing part. In a way, it worked. Even though they were defeated on the battlefield, the people of Bastar won a huge victory. The government completely suspended its plan to reserve the forests, and they cut the area they were going to take by almost half. Resistance was not futile. Okay, so that's all history, but why does any of it matter today? Because this conflict from over a century ago, this fight over who controls the forest and what it's for, is still echoing in all of our environmental debates right now. The hypocrisy of the system was just staggering. Think about this. If you were a local villager hunting for dinner, you were a poacher and a criminal. But if you were a British officer hunting a tiger for sport, you were a celebrated hero. They even gave out rewards for killing big predators, which led to the slaughter of over 80,000 tigers and 150,000 leopards in just 50 years. The numbers are just unbelievable. And if things weren't bad enough, the world wars just threw gasoline on the fire. When war broke out, all those so-called scientific forest management plans went right out the window. The British cut down trees recklessly to meet their war needs, absolutely devastating the forests in India, Indonesia, and across their colonies. It's really only since the 1980s that we've started to see a real change in thinking. Governments across Asia and Africa are finally starting to realize that the old colonial way of doing things, of kicking local people out to protect a forest, just doesn't work. It just creates more conflict. Now, there's a growing understanding that real, effective conservation has to include the communities who actually call the forest home. And all of this leaves us with a final, really critical question. The legacy of this whole story forces us to ask ourselves, today, in the 21st century, when we talk about protecting a forest, whose idea of a forest are we protecting? Who are we protecting it for? And maybe just as important, who are we protecting it from?